video or visual legal advocacy roundtable. My name is Craig Martin. I'm a visiting fellow and lecturer here at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and I'll be moderating this afternoon's panel. Professor Austin invited me because I have played around with making some documentaries while I was here researching something entirely different. And our topic this afternoon, as the program indicates, is cameras everywhere, making sense of surveillance and Vérité footage from the streets. And as the title and the introduction in the program indicates, this is a discussion that's going to explore the various issues around how lawyers are to make sense of and how to make use of the increasing amount of video footage that is exploding in current usage in society. It's often used as evidence in criminal proceedings and administrative proceedings, but the issues that are raised go beyond simply the judicial process. I mean, it raises issues as to whether the rules of evidence need to be adjusted in order to accommodate the use of increasing amounts of Vérité footage shot on the street. And it also raises questions for lawyers who are involved in the policy-making process as to in the many ways that they have to deal with the increasing amount of surveillance in our society. We're very fortunate today to have two people join us who have a great deal of insight and deep understanding of a number of these issues. The first, to my far right, is Mr. Ron Kanter, who is a documentary filmmaker and television producer, has made a number of films that explore different aspects of the criminal justice system. And thus, as a filmmaker involved in the criminal justice system, can provide insight and can speak to us from both sides of the camera, so to speak. There's a great deal of information in the bio material in the program and on the website that's referred to in the program, so I won't go over it. But just a couple of points that are not related there is that Mr. Kanter is both a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and a graduate of Temple University here in Philadelphia, and has won 2 Emmys, in addition to a number of other prestigious awards. To my immediate right, it's always the low-level technology that gives you problems. To my immediate right is Professor John MacDonald, who is the Jerry Lee Professor of Criminology and the Undergraduate Chair of Criminology here at the University of Pennsylvania in the School of Arts and Sciences. And his work in the field of criminology includes exploring issues relating to the interactions between police and members of society that result in violence, and also racial issues and other aspects of the interaction between police and minorities in society. And so these are the very types of activities or interactions between police and members of society that are increasingly becoming the subject of video footage. And we only have to think back to the Rodney King trial, which is sort of one of the starting points of this kind of issue, to appreciate just how important those types of interactions are to the issues that we're talking about today. Our third scheduled speaker, I should say that Professor MacDonald's background is outlined in some detail in the biographical material, and his very extensive CV is also available online with a list of publications longer than my arm, but very interesting for anyone who wants to pursue that further. Our third scheduled speaker is Ms. Eileen Clancy of Eyewitness Video, and who was unfortunately not able to travel to Philadelphia today because of a work-related crisis, but she sent her regrets. But her information and some websites are also available in the biographical material if you want to follow up on that. So each speaker will have, because we only had 2 speakers, each speaker will have approximately half an hour, and I'll signal you when you have a few minutes left. And then we're going to have a half hour or so for discussion and questions, so I really would encourage everyone to think of questions and to engage very actively at the end. So thank you very much, and Ms. Kanter.
Hi. Well, I'm very happy to be here. Appreciate the invitation from Regina. I think, I'm not an attorney, I'm a filmmaker. but I'm very conscious of the issues that are raised by making documentary films. Because I take very seriously the responsibility to present what I feel is an accurate portrayal. But it's my feeling, which means that it's subjective. I'm going to show a couple clips from a film I made about the Philadelphia Police Department. And in many ways, this is different, very different from most of the video that you might see of police activity. It was not shot on a cell phone. I had cooperation from the police department. I was committed to follow police officers through the Philadelphia Police Academy for their whole training over a period of 8 months. And I spent many days riding with police officers as they did their job. But there is cooperation and there is cooperation. And my agreement with the officers was that I would film everything unless they asked me specifically not to. And they didn't have to give me a reason. All they had to do was to ask me to turn off the camera, and I would turn off the camera. If I filmed something, it was my decision whether or not to use that. I had an officer at one point say to me, when I asked him if there was anything specific that I should keep in mind, he said, don't do anything that would get me in trouble. I thought, no, that's an interesting approach. What does that mean? So I asked him what he meant, because I had seen a lot of things that I thought might cause him some problems. What he meant was occasionally he would stop a car. Often when he stopped a car, they had no insurance, no driver's license, no owner's card. He was a very aggressive officer, and he was really interested in major crimes. He really wasn't interested in people who were driving without insurance. So occasionally, he would tell the person, well, lock up the car and go home and get your license or get your insurance card. And he didn't want me to show that, because his job was to impound that car. Why didn't he do that? Because it would take anywhere from an hour to a whole day for a tow truck to come, and he'd have to sit there and babysit the car. He didn't want to do that. So in his opinion, it was for the greater good that he would let this guy go, knowing full well that the guy would walk around the block, and as soon as the police car disappeared, he'd come back and take the car. A lot of things that I thought were much more questionable, you know, illegal search, abusive language, just a general approach to citizens, he felt that was the way you do the job. So he wasn't concerned about my showing that. So in thinking or in suggesting how you might think about the implications of footage, there are a number of points to consider. One is that everything that's shot is subjective. It's either consciously or unconsciously one person's point of view. And so you're not seeing everything. As it says in the little write-up, what's outside the frame, what's not being shown, may be just as important or maybe more important than what you're seeing. And in most instances, there's no way to know what's not being shown. You don't know what transpired before, what transpired afterwards, or what's even taking place simultaneously outside of the view of the camera or the audio. And I would suggest that audio is at least as important as what is being seen, because often the content is not clear visually, whereas the audio will provide insight that you couldn't get otherwise. A police officer said to me that his philosophy was, believe none of what you see and only half of what you hear. And his example was driving down the street, he sees two guys in a fight. He pulls over, one guy runs away. Turns out the guy who's still there was being mugged. He observed, you know, what was in fact a robbery taking place. But even though he's an experienced police officer, his interpretation of what he was seeing was unclear. So I'd like to show a couple of clips from this film called New Cops. The first one I purposely included in the film because I wanted people to be aware of the fact that this was a movie. This was not a recording of reality that included everything possible.
Right there he is! Right there! Right there! He's running down Montgomery Avenue. Towards that mustache. Which way, Andy? Right here, Montgomery, right here. There he is. Get ready, Andy. Wow, right here, right here. Down! He's got him. Damn, man. Highway 10, we got one apprehension. Get down your knees. Get down your knees. Put your hands on top of your head. All right? I think that was already there. You from Temple, right? Yeah, he's the one that had. Check, make sure he don't drop no gun behind that truck.
I would say that I'm a proactive police officer. I don't want to wait for the man to pull up on a corner and shoot the corner up. I want to catch him before he has a chance to shoot the corner up. I don't want to wait for a drug dealer to spread his poison. I want to stop him before he's able to spread that poison. I don't want to have to be the one pulling up on a corner and picking up Johnny, 16 years old, with a bullet wound to his chest, blood's pouring out, gasping for air. And I don't want to be the last person that he ever sees on this earth. Why'd your boy run in the car, man?
Huh?
Why'd your boy run in the car?
I don't know. Honestly, I don't know.
How many people you could have just killed?
I wasn't driving, sir. I'm not driving, sir. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I'm scared myself. I don't.
So why did you run? If you weren't driving?
I'm scared. I've been beat by police before.
You've been beaten?
Yeah.
Ron, cut that camera.
So, what happened after he asked me to turn off the camera? Actually, nothing. He gave him a lecture about saying that kind of thing and accusing the police of brutality. But I thought it was interesting that
Arts Fund and the Philip.
that he was so upset or concerned by somebody accusing the police of brutality, even though nothing had happened in this particular instance, that he asked me to turn off the camera. In 2 weeks of riding around with him, he never asked me to turn off the camera, except for that one instance. So, again, just to reiterate, you're not seeing everything. And in many instances, the ability to record what's going on is much more restricted than the situation that I had. But the situation that I had, and all documentary filmmakers have, is a limitation in terms of equipment, manpower, access, all kinds of things that limit what is even potentially included in the presentation or the recording that you're seeing. And then if you're seeing an edited program, and most documentaries obviously are edited, you're only seeing a very small percentage of what was actually recorded. So there's another subjective editorial decision going on about what to include. This film is an hour long, and it's derived from somewhere around 300 hours of video. So, you know, any given moment, the odds are, 300 to 1 that it's going to end up in the finished film. The next piece that I'd like to show is actually what I put at the very beginning of the film, because I thought it was instructive in terms of what the film is about. I thought it was an insight and a demonstration of the issues that were going to be raised for the next hour. So let me show it to you, see what you think.
Ask him what he's doing there.
What are you doing there? Huh? What are y'all doing there?
Take a walk.
Yo, man.
Take a walk, big man. We come back around, you're going for a ride.
For what?
Obstructing the highway. What's he saying?
I don't know. Shall I line him up?
No.
Oh, okay.
What would you lock him up for?
I don't know. I think it's something. I'm obstructing the highway.
Now what we'll do is we'll give him the opportunity to get himself locked up.
Okay.
Now what's the problem? Yeah, you do. Where do you live at? Tough guy, right? Tough guy? Excuse me?
What'd you say?
Who are you talking to? Huh? There you go.
I didn't mean that.
There you go.
Now you didn't
There
mean
you
it,
go. Tough guy. Hey, do me a favor, transfer him in, please. We're gonna lock him up for it.
Obstructing the highway, disorderly conduct, maybe even.
Which one?
We can get him for disorderly conduct, probably.
What do you need for disorderly conduct?
Ignoring the cops, being disobedient, maybe disruptive.
Disorderly conduct, he needs to be loud, boisterous, use profanity, draw a crowd, make people come to their windows and stuff like that. Well, he didn't do that until after we were going to lock him up. So what we'll lock him up for is obstructing the highway. He was told numerous times to leave the area.
Okay.
He refused to leave and follow police orders.
Right.
Subsequently, man was placed under arrest for obstructing the highway.
To me, that was a précis of what the film was about. You know, that's a summation of the film in a minute and a half. You know, the discretion that police officers have, the somewhat arbitrary nature of how they might exercise that discretion. It also could have been. Okay, sorry. It also could have been edited in many different ways. I could very easily have left out the material of the rookie cop not knowing the law. I could have left out the comment where the experienced officer says we'll give him the opportunity to get himself arrested. The raw material of the scene, and obviously there's a little bit more that isn't in here, could have been presented in a number of ways that range from raising issues about police attitudes and the exercise of police power to just another arrest of a delinquent on the corner. You know, it's referred to as quality of life crimes, which many people believe if you crack down on quality of life crimes, you short circuit a lot of the more serious crimes. So this could be viewed as a very positive scene on the part of the police, putting their foot down for quality of life. Every filmmaker, every thoughtful filmmaker has to deal with those issues each time, and you as an attorney or advocate, someone using visual material to advance your cause, also need to keep in mind that an audience, a jury, or whatever audience you might be showing it to, is filtering what you present through their own experience. And I'd like to tell you one short anecdote of my experience presenting this film. The film was funded in large part by National Public Television. I received a major grant that allowed me to complete the editing and do some of the final shooting. It was shown in Philadelphia on Channel 12, and I was offered an opportunity to distribute it nationally to all the PBS stations. The one caveat was they wanted me to cut off the first scene in the film, the scene that I just showed you. The scene that I thought was the way to open the film because it sort of stated what the film was about. Experienced programmers for National Public Television felt that it wasn't exciting enough, that it was a little slow, and that they might lose some of the audience. People switched to another channel if that was the film that began the program. So it's not in the nationally distributed version of the film. These are people who supposedly know a lot about looking at movies. And their judgment was that that scene, if not irrelevant, was at least a handicap to the success of the film in terms of holding an audience. So I think it's really important to consider what you're showing to people from their point of view. It's very easy to feel that what you have is a terrific representation of whatever point you're interested in making. And it may in fact be there. That doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to get that. When this film came out, the police department was very upset. And I know this not because they said it to me, because they didn't say anything directly to me. I had arranged a screening the week before this was shown. It was shown at the Philadelphia International Film Festival. And as a courtesy, I offered to screen it for the police commissioner. He didn't come, but his public affairs office sent about 4 people. They watched the film. They didn't say anything to me. They said thank you, and they left. One of the officers got a call from his captain about 10 minutes later and was severely chastised for some of the things that he did in the film. The officer had never seen the film at that point. He was very upset when he called me, and I was actually a little frightened because he was going to come to my studio to watch the film. He and his partner came to my studio and watched the film. By the time the film was over, they were like, what's the big deal? This is the job. Yeah, maybe we shouldn't have said this or that, but, they'll get over it. This is the way you do police work. So there you have 2 very different opinions based on perception, based on goals. The police department wasn't happy with some of the statistics that I showed in the film. They weren't happy with some of the things that were, questionable in terms of police regulations. But there was no Rodney King footage in the film. The officers and every officer that I've ever spoken to about this film has felt that this film captures their job very well. But the bureaucracy that's responsible for supervising the people who do the job was not happy with it. So again, think about what it is that you hope to accomplish by presenting some visual material, and then think about your audience. I mean, that's the kind of thing that is taught in film school. Think about the audience, because the audience is your ultimate goal, and they are not necessarily going to view everything that you show them in the way that you view it. Well, maybe I'll stop there and let John have a few words.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a hard act to follow visual material with non-visual material. So I'll do my best. But this actually was a good setup for what I'm going to talk about. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the actual use of video from the concept of studying the police and discretion, but really dating back to what I'll refer to as systematic social observation. And so this really goes back. There's been about 4 decades of research on police decision making that have relied on systematic social observations. About 30 years ago, actually more than that now, 1971, Albert Rees, who is a distinguished professor of sociology and law at Yale, advocated for the use of this approach for studying the police. And what he meant by systematic social observation was a strategy for trying to observe natural phenomena, directly observing things as they're happening, recording them systematically, whether this is a person or some form of technology. And the whole idea is that in this case, technology, or in the 1960s, a person should be independent from what they're observing, kind of a passive bystander. And it was his view, and many others, that this was a natural way to go about trying to not only observe the police, but also explain police behavior. Seeing things and events as they occur in the natural world. So it's much different than trying to talk about the police through a training video or through individual legal cases for that matter. And so starting in the 1960s, actually, the ABF, the American Bar Foundation, which I don't need to explain what that is to this audience, actually set out on a series of studies to look at the criminal justice process. Professor Wayne Lefebvre wrote a book in the 60s where he talks about some of the observations from these systematic social observations. Why is this important? It's because, for exactly what this film was showing, when it comes to police discretion, the rules of law don't give you all the specifics. You know, they give you the generalities. And he even notes in chapter 3 here, because the exercise of discretion involves decision making not strictly governed by legal rules, but rather with a significant element of personal judgment, it's sometimes said to be totally improper in criminal law enforcement, where the consequences of official action directly affect a citizen's freedom and property. So this idea that the whole idea that the police are completely governed by legal rules and the discretion doesn't play out is something that in the early 60s, through a series of studies, social scientists and legal scholars realized just wasn't the case. That the typical officer's decision making is bound by some covenants of law, but also organizational rules, procedures, and in some cases what we've called street justice. So this approach to trying to go about studying the police is really important, not just from a social science standpoint of how can we capture, measure, and explain the police, but I think it's going to be increasingly important from a legal perspective as well. Because if we're going to understand how the law should operate, it's important to think about people who, at the kind of the front end of the legal system, the police. And so there's been a substantive body of research that's been produced on this. Much of it is quantitative. People take these coding instruments and they create measures to try to explain the interactions between police and citizens and how the police then arrive at decisions for, in this case, making an actual arrest. But what's really important, I think, beyond the decision to arrest people is to understand that arrests occur in less than 10% of police-citizen interactions. So it's a relatively rare event. What's really important is not just what actually happened and why there was an arrest, but what led up to the arrest in the first place. So, for example, if I had not seen this videotape, but someone had just recorded it systematically, did a social observation, what we would know is, more than likely from that coding sheet, we would know that the officer stopped, this citizen on the corner asked him to leave. He did not, or he reluctantly left, and then later on it would say something to the effect of, the the officer asked a question, the citizen, you know, made a threatening statement or so forth, and then arrest was made. So that would have gotten coded in an instrument as disobedience or a lack of deference on the part of the citizen. But what you don't see, and you see in the video, is that the officer saying, let's give this guy an opportunity to get himself arrested, right? And this is actually really important to think about even in contemporary kind of policy discussions. For example, the beer summit at the White House. You know, obviously there was no videotape there, but I can imagine a series of interactions were occurring that resulted in the arrest of Professor Gates. So where does video come into play? I think video comes into play because it allows us to create a broader picture. We can't capture everything in video, but we can talk about these substantive issues, and we can actually get a more objective assessment than we will with your typical kind of ride-along observational study. And so this isn't to negate the work that Al Reese, Donald Black, many others, including myself, have done. But the problem with most of these kind of earlier studies is that it's always plagued by observer bias. We don't really know the extent which the police are going to behave the way they normally would if somebody's sitting there with an instrument, a sheet, and rating things. You could make the same observation about videotape as well, in this case, a film. Although in the defense of the kind of systematic social observation, Al Reese did note that on the first night of field work, they observed a abuse of authority, drinking on the job, and an officer taking a bribe. So this does, you know, the suggestion that police completely change their behavior because they're being observed, I think that's a case in point. And this was the 1960s, but this video footage is much, obviously, it's contemporary. But one of the options now we have is increasingly police departments around this country are getting putting cameras in cars, providing cameras that are actually have more high resolution, can record the actual interactions in terms of the actual verbal interactions that are going on, and so that really opens up to a lot of possibilities. We can get potentially more objective assessment that isn't necessarily biased by individual observer, and this technology, as the technology improves, our ability to get these assessments will improve also. And a good example of where this has been used was a study that I was involved in looking at police minority relations in the city of Cincinnati. This was part of a collaborative agreement, or which is a kind of a nicer way of saying consent decree, that was settled between the city of Cincinnati and the civil division in the Justice Department. And one of the aspects of the collaborative agreement was to actually have somebody evaluate the progress that the Cincinnati police were making. At the time I was working at the Rand Corporation, and I was tasked to run major aspects of this project. In addition to studying patterns and practices for stopping citizens, arresting citizens, looking at police citizen satisfaction, one of the other tasks that was really interesting was actually looking at video footage. So what we did is we randomly sampled hours of video footage from the police. So as opposed to taking a film and trying to edit to what's interesting or what's not interesting, the idea here is to get a snapshot that's representative of how the police interact with citizens in general. So the idea is you get more of a scientific snapshot that's not biased to different interactions. And where this was really interesting is some of the findings that came out of this study. For example, one set of findings was published in the Journal of Communication, was looking at 313 randomly sampled video recordings from police traffic stops in Cincinnati. What the analysts found were that, on average, black drivers were more likely to experience extensive policing during the stop, questions about do they have warrants out for them, not having paid tickets, being held up for extra amount of time, on the order of 5 to 7 minutes, which actually the assistant chief of Cincinnati said he didn't personally see a problem with that. It's only 5 minutes of someone's life. Why does it matter if we hold them an extra 5 minutes? He said, well, it's systematically this way towards African Americans. And, but hey, it's only 5 minutes. But if you think about from the perspective of a citizen sitting there, that 5 minutes can feel like an eternity. Also found that the communication quality for white drivers was on average more positive than the communication quality towards black drivers. And I'll explain how these findings were arrived at, because this actually is important for thinking about the legal system and how cases can be challenged. And then third, that officers' communication behavior was more positive on average when the officer and the driver were of the same race. So we have a white officer and a white driver, on average, more positive communication than when you have different race. Same thing, black officer, white citizen, less positive interaction. Now, one of the things that just comes out, even if that was the only disparity observed, 75% of police stops in Cincinnati are a white officer and a black citizen. So just on the average there's a tremendous communication disparity, just on the burden of who's being stopped in their cars routinely. So in terms of actually going back, and I want to talk just a little bit about how this kind of research gets done and where it can be used, where I think it can be potentially really useful. One of the things to note is even this study was somewhat flawed by the quality of the footage. This footage here was excellent. The footage in Cincinnati, the camera quality at the time was rather poor in terms of crispness of the photos and being able to hear the interactions. So what was necessary was basically trying to come up with a way to record this information, to evaluate it, that was systematic, capturing what was available. So there were some limits to that. And so how this was done was essentially a group of communications graduate students were trained as basically a jury on the rules for rating each one of these video interactions. And they were of mixed race background. They were trained how to watch the tape, what to look for, and there was a series of rules in terms of how they're supposed to rate quality, length of time, interactions, etc. And they were trained on this, and then they did it each one independently, and they found a high degree of agreement between the observers. Think of them like a jury, and the jury's generally agreeing on what they're observing. And this type of approach has been used a lot in communication and psychology research as well. So high degree of rater reliability in terms of the raters kind of having general agreement. And then it was used to kind of uncover these systematic patterns. Now, where this is important, I think, is talking about the quality of police interactions, observing them. This kind of approach can be used, for example, in routine audits. Some departments have talked about this. Randomly sampling, taking a random sample of officers, just routinely on a monthly basis and auditing these video interactions. And then using that tool as an approach for training, for example. Telling officers, the language quality, for example, could be improved. That might not be strictly a legal issue, but it does have legal implications if you think about how these interactions escalate. For example, we do know that aggressive language is more likely to result in a aggressive response from a citizen, which then on average can escalate into unfortunate incidents like not just an arrest but police use of force. So training officers on quality of communication is important. In some instances, even training citizens. If citizens, through different community forums it can be honestly discussed about the way that they're interacting with officers. That can be important. And then also the use of civil lawsuits. If you think about when there's a case and there's video footage on it and it's of reasonable quality, the question could be made of how typical is this interaction compared to the usual routine practice. And if you can show systematically that what's occurred here is completely different than what you would expect on average, that's assuming the average is legal, right? But assuming that on average officers are obeying the law, appropriately using their discretion, you can show in a civil case that this is clearly outside the norm even within your own agency. I think that's really important. There's also the potential here for protecting the police. So not just discussing, what the police are doing wrong in situations, but also what they're doing right. It's often the case that people make allegations about, for example, abuse of authority. Say that they were abused, that they were unfairly, strangled on the ground, or there was an excessive force case. And then, being able to pull this video footage and actually observe what occurred provides a third-party assessment, assuming you have reasonable footage. And I've seen from my own research, for example, in Miami, that you get varying opinions, right? Officers and citizens will often have extreme disagreement on what exactly occurred, and the video at least allows for a third-party picture to come in there. For example, kind of a classic story in Miami, in these use of force cases, the police officer would say, "I was trying to cuff the suspect, and he or she tripped and fell and hit her head on the sidewalk." The suspect would say, "I was thrown to the ground, and my head was hit against the sidewalk, and then I was cuffed." And not having a video there, it's you don't have an objective third party. Some departments have tried to use any kind of force report. They'll have a supervisor, a sergeant, for example, have to sign off on it and agree to the interaction. Well, that's better than not having it, but that sergeant or that supervisor clearly has a conflict of interest, especially when you think about from the perspective of trying to defend the police organization. So the video footage, I think, is really important from protecting civil liberties. It's also an important vehicle for thinking about how to improve police. Much of if you look at, for example, racial disparities in perceptions of the police, racial bias policing, racial profiling, abuse of authority, and much of this isn't just about these actual interactions, because like I said, talking about less than 10% of the interactions, and when it comes to use of force, less than 2%, but it's about the quality of the communication that's occurring. And then in terms of the legal decision making, this video footage is a key case in point. You can see distinctly the build-up to these interactions. Maybe the actual arrest itself is technically legal, but what led up to it in the first place? If the officer instigated the situation, tried to put the person in a position where they essentially had no choice but to violate the law, that also brings a new element into legal defense. It also brings a new element into think about training officers on what's suspicious behavior, for example. This case, where the individual standing on the street corner obstructing the highway, what made that individual so suspicious? Say loitering. Is that really suspicious? Is that really an important thing to try to enforce? I know there's been a lot of discussion about zero tolerance policing, broken windows theory. The approach that's been used in New York, for example, over the years, in Los Angeles when Chief Bratton came to LA. But what often doesn't get discussed is much of that crime reduction was not driven by arresting people for trying to squeegee people's windows, but was the fact that they actually employed fairly sophisticated crime mapping and anti-robbery units that went out and tried to arrest people who had lots of warrants out for them. There's very little research to indicate that harassing people for staying on street corners reduces crime. But if officers are trained to do this, right, then arrest rates go up for often what is really routine kind of citizen interactions that escalate. Officers are trained to try to use the law in a way that might not be not only constitutionally appropriate, but not appropriate from the standpoint of public safety. So I think that the real advantage we have with video surveillance is not just looking at individual actions, but it's actually getting a better snapshot, a better picture of police behavior, and looking at where it's systematically biased, where it could be fixed, how interactions could be improved, and how just we can retrain police. And also, you know, one of the things is I think worth pointing out is, and you know, maybe I'm in the right forum to say this, is that you need lawsuits often to change police departments. Police department training, for example, is often it's passed down through the years. It's unconventional wisdom. Even when there's research out there that suggests better approaches, very few police departments like to change the way they train officers. But when there's a lawsuit that now costs the city or a municipality millions of dollars, it is amazing how quickly the police will be willing to change. A good case in point for this was the Garner decision on police use of deadly force. Almost a decade after the Garner decision, there was some research done looking at departments around the country and whether or not they had changed their policies on police use of deadly force, saying that, you know, you can only shoot someone in the case of a violent felony or trying to prevent serious violence from occurring. And what was found is that the majority of police departments in the country had not changed their policies. They still had the old policy, the fleeing felon rule, that said that officers could shoot anybody fleeing from the scene of a felony. But that has changed over the last 20 years because departments have routinely been sued. And so I think that, you know, it's not only good from the standpoint of the legal community, but from the policy community that we have lawsuits that push the police to change. Some department administrators, police chiefs, commissioners would like to change policies and practices, but it's very difficult to get organizations to change. And so sometimes a consent decree, a lawsuit, can be a good enough excuse to actually institute major reforms in police agencies. So those are my concluding comments, and I would be actually more than happy to also distribute this example of this publication where you could actually see how this kind of this idea of taking video footage and systematically recording it and using it to explain disparities in police interactions is a good tool that I think could be replicated in other cities and even in potential litigation.
Well, thank you very much. Perhaps before I start taking questions, I'll ask a couple of my own. And since we have time, Professor Austin had asked me to sort of somehow work in something about the video that I was shooting a year ago. So let me tell you a little bit about that as the context for my question. So the video that I was shooting here in Philadelphia was really about the murder rate and the gun laws and the relationship between them in Philadelphia and in Pennsylvania more broadly, which morphed into issues about race and a number of other factors that I thought tied into it. But as part of that, I went on a 4-hour ride with the Philadelphia police in West Philly one night, sort of along the lines of what we just saw at the beginning of the talk. And it was a sort of a midnight shift, and their understanding was that I was supposed to be shooting their response to a shooting. So I mean, the whole idea was there was going to be a shooting. There's over 3,000 shootings in Philadelphia a year, and so there's a good chance that in a 4-hour period there'd be a shooting, and I'd get to video the response. But it was a slow night, and there were no shootings. And so we started pulling people over and searching them. And so the first such stop, we stopped the car. I'm shooting with the video camera. They get out, and it's just like an episode of Cops. You know, I jump out with the video camera. They pull the people out of the car. They're up against the, you know, on the bonnet, being one cop holding their belt, the other one first tamping them down, then going in and searching the car. We get back into the car after the first one. We do about 15 of these over the course of the 4 hours. And I asked him, I said, so what were we searching for? Well, why did we stop those guys? He said, well, they didn't indicate when they turned right at that corner. And so I said, that's it? They didn't indicate? Yeah. I said, so what was the reasonable and probable cause for the search? At which point they looked at each other, looked back at me, and sort of said, what are you, a lawyer? And I said, well, kind of. You know, and I'm trying not to be difficult. I mean, they're doing me a favor by taking me out, and this isn't the objective of the film, but as we go, we are stopping cars for not indicating and for having tinted windows, and searching everybody, and searching their cars, which struck me as bizarre. And as the night wore on, I sort of said, but let me understand this. I said, like, I'm thinking that if I turn right down a Rittenhouse Square and don't indicate, that I'm not going to get stopped and bent over the bonnet of my car like this. And they looked at each other and I said, well, yeah, but that's Rittenhouse Square, isn't it? And, you know, it was no, obviously we're in West Philly, and everybody we stopped was black. And, you know, it struck me as quite bizarre, and it's along the lines of what we've heard today, that there's this incredible discretion on the part of the police. And the discretion that they exercise is quite separate and apart from the actual black letter law that they're supposed to be following. But I tell that story in part to set up the context for the question, which is, to what extent, and it relates to two aspects of filming in this context. To what extent does the filming impact on the subjects of your film? Because there were two elements of this. One was that I got the distinct impression that the policemen were trying to give me something to shoot, because I was supposed to be out there shooting them, you know, riding off into the sunset, getting bad guys shooting people, and that wasn't happening. And so they were making my night a little more exciting. And the second aspect was that, and this was actually in some respects kind of tragic, the people that we were stopping, and some of these people were, you know, teenagers, were entirely fatalistic about the police conduct. It's like, you know, it's sort of like, here we go again. But then they'd see me, and then they'd get sort of extrapolated and go, what the hell is he doing? Like, what's the camera for? What are they doing? And so they were also being affected by the shooting. You know, so it sort of relates to the principle in science that you can't measure anything without altering the thing that's being measured and therefore distorting the measurement. And so I guess the question is twofold. One, as a documentary maker, how do you try to ensure that the shooting of the documentary isn't affecting the way that the subjects are acting, either negatively or positively, but in some way sort of anomalous to their normal behavior? And then I guess the second question is more from the behavior of police generally. To what extent is there empirical evidence to suggest that just the availability of video footage, not just within their patrol cars, but just the number of embarrassing incidents where people with cell phones or other video footage have caught the police not only engaging in illegal behavior, but then engaging in trying to cover it up before they realize that there's video footage out there. To what extent is that starting to filter through and change police behavior?
Well, I mean, I think they're really good questions. One thing that occurs to me, though, I think, which I think we all understand, but maybe we should make explicit, is that visual material, particularly when we're talking about video, comes in a whole continuum of forms. And if you watch primetime television, there's always a security camera on the parking lot that shows whether the good guys or the bad guys walk through there. And within its limited purview, that's a pretty objective recording of an event or a non-event. And then as you move through that continuum, you have more traditional news, documentary footage, and maybe Michael Moore's documentary style at another end of the continuum. And it's important to understand the differences between something where there's just a camera running and it records whatever happens to move in front of it, and a camera that's operated by somebody who's making lots of decisions in terms of what they're recording and the way in which they're going to record it, so on. As far as the recording influencing behavior, it's a really important point to consider. And I think most documentary filmmakers' experience is that initially there is sometimes fairly severe effect on your subject. Everybody wants to look good. Everybody wants to please Everybody wants to provide, as you said, you know, you're there to get some action. They want to give you some action, even though if they're doing it in a way that's very questionable. But over the long term, and this again varies with the subject and the interpersonal skills of the filmmaker, people act the way they act. They are who they are, and if they're trying to provide something to you, they're doing that based on their perception of what they should be doing. And they can only act within the range of their understanding and their personality. Very few people can put up a facade and maintain that facade over an extended period of time. I do think that it's really important in terms of documentary filmmaking as opposed to security cameras, that the filmmaker plays a significant role in revealing some ultimate truth about the subject. You know, people have different skill sets, and you know, in my professional life as a maker of films, I know a number of camera people who are equally skilled, but I would choose a camera person based on the type of production I'm involved in. So for instance, if I'm making a commercial, a television commercial, where I'm basically being paid to make a product look good, there is a cameraman that I would hire, and he would spend a week lighting a cereal box if I had that amount of time to offer him. But he will make it look really good. I would never hire that guy to shoot a documentary where lights are an intrusion and probably never even come into play. Another cameraman that I know who's equally skilled considers lights to be a pain in the neck. But he's great with people. So if I'm involved in something and I want to keep the subject people sort of focused, I'm perfectly comfortable allowing that cameraman to talk to them to keep them occupied until I can come back. So even though they're equally skilled as camera operators or camera lighting directors, whatever you want to call it, their skills are very different. And the same thing with filmmakers. Some filmmakers, you know, are sort of, you know, quick and dirty in and out. Other people are, you know, good at schmoozing, getting people to reveal themselves. There's a quote which I think is valuable by one of the Maisel brothers, a famous pair of documentary filmmakers, who said, if you're always shooting, you'll never get anything. And I read this quote out of context, and it took me a while to understand what he was saying. But basically, he was saying, if you always have the camera running, you have no opportunity to interact personally with the subject. And so part of your job as a filmmaker is not only to record things, but to put people at ease so that you can record significant events. So you could shoot 24/7 and get nothing if you didn't have a relationship with the subject. And so that's another way of you know, sort of viewing the material. There's one other thing that I'd like to say. I'm going to preempt John, but you know, we've talked, and I think John mentioned quantitative and referring to statistics and you know, apparent bias or the possibility of bias. We often see statistics or numbers as being objective measures of something. And as anybody who's ever taken a statistics course knows, you know, you can make statistics say pretty much whatever you want. But it's easier or more likely that you would assume that numbers are accurate. Whereas video and other kinds of visual material are considered to be qualitative rather than quantitative. That's, you know, equally untrue or equally true depending on your point of view. But one thing that is different about video, or potentially different about video, is that video films, documentary, again, as opposed to, you know, some sort of security camera, is that video is a medium of affect. It sort of goes back to what I was saying before, to think about your audience. People do not respond to video, particularly dramatic video, somebody being beat up or somebody suffering, in an objective way. They respond emotionally. And you, as an attorney or as somebody who's using this medium as an advocate, needs to recognize that potential. In the same way we saw this morning, the first picture or the first series of pictures were very touching images of kids, and then horrible images of kitchens and places that none of us would like to visit. Yes, you could say, well, it's just, you know, documenting the situation, but the way we respond to it is not, you know, well, what percentage of people live in this situation, but geez, you know, I wouldn't want my child to be in that situation, or I wouldn't want to have to, you know, live in that kitchen or even walk into that building. So that affective element of visual material is a really important consideration.
Okay. In terms of, so go back to your question in terms of how has this affected police behavior, the honest answer is we don't know. We do know enough from research, following what Ron was saying, that the longer observers are there, or the longer, in this case, cameras are there, the less likely there is to be that kind of response bias. One of the advantages of cameras, maybe not from the documentary standpoint, but just even having cameras in cars, is that, well, in the case of a long documentary, like Ron was saying, is people will become less guarded. But the real advantage, I think, is you don't have, when you have an observer there constantly, relationships can develop, and then you can't have real biases, either in the sense of being biased, like you were saying, trying to do too much because they don't want you to be bored. Okay, we're going to start stopping a lot of cars. I'm sorry tonight's boring. Maybe we'll frisk some people. So having that kind of bias, or the other bias, which is officers just completely clamming up. And I do know from some work I was engaged in, racial profiling, looking where we actually, in the Miami-Dade, required officers to start filling out forms whenever they stopped citizens, that we had to discard the first 2 months of data because there was clearly a major work slowdown. Officers were responding to the forms, so they just weren't going to stop anyone. And then after a few months, it picked back up again. Part of it's people realizing that these are relatively rare events, even if it's a videotape that they're going to be audited on. If it's relatively rare, eventually people will adjust back to their usual way. Now, on the other hand, you can tell the story where audits are maybe less rare, that it could be corrected. So I think that, you know, there is the potential, but it hasn't been studied systematically yet, except for the standpoint of kind of your traditional anthropological view, which is the longer kind of with the subjects, the more they'll adjust to you, and the less bias that the observer will elicit. But I think, you know, with kind of the objective camera, and that gets to the point of cameras aren't going to pick up on everything. There's a whole context. But where I disagree on statistics is I think if you can show a systematic pattern that is different for one, say, group of people or one part of Philadelphia than another, it's another statistician could come in and claim that, yeah, the underlying dispersion parameter you're using is wrong, but on the average, if you show these patterns, it's still, I think, informative. But it has to be married with the qualitative sense, too, of what does this really mean in human terms? Because Ron's exactly right. You're not going to be able to convince people to change just on the numbers. If you said, okay, on average, you know, 5 more minutes, you know, that might really not elicit, as opposed to showing an interaction where someone's being bent over the car, for example. If you said, you know, 5 times, if you're African American male in Philadelphia, you have 5 times the likelihood of a pat down by the police. That, to the average person, might not seem that troubling. But if you can show on video footage what that pat down actually means, and how, you know, in many ways, you know, being forced to lay on the street, you know, having a gun drawn on you, you know, that's an intense experience. And you know, so I think that there's a way to blend the two of them together. So I'm very optimistic about the use of cameras and surveillance for actually the greater public good. I'm extremely optimistic that that this can be used from not just a social science standpoint, but a real standpoint of trying to reform patterns and practices.
Thank you. Just a quick comment in response to Ron's point about video being sort of an affective medium and the visceral impact it can have on audiences. In the Rodney King trial, the defense team, the lawyers defending the police, decided to combat that by actually showing the video over and over and over again, frame by frame, analyzing each frame to try and just assess and show to the jury exactly what was going on. And the underlying strategy behind that was to desensitize them to the incredible visceral response that you would have when you initially watched the video. So by the end of the trial, the jury had seen it so many times that it had lost a lot of its impact. But yes, we'll start with questions. I hope there's lots.
I had sort of maybe an overly legalistic, but I think potentially policy type of question, which is, I guess starting with the work that you did in Cincinnati, the videotape and the report, with individual civil rights plaintiffs bringing cases not just against the individual officers, but against the city and proceeding under Monell claims, are they able to use that kind of evidence in trial? Have they been? And if that is evidence, ends up being admissible, does that end up being a problem with cities who are willing to engage in this not as a result of a consent decree, but because they're interested in improving the police, but then their risk management people come in and say, you know, you really can't do this because these Monell claims are, you know, they're limitless. They're not, you know, limited to the individual officer's means.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I know in Los Angeles that was an issue, but they also, the risk management folks were also interested in it from the standpoint of also protecting the risk because of the claims that can often become, you know, can be fabricated. And so the idea, but the issue of the resources you have to put in to address it is potentially a problem. This completely has nothing to do with the law, but just from an IT standpoint, they realized that they didn't have a big enough server for the police department at the time to store all the video footage. And so it was going to cost a couple $1 million just to buy a big enough server. And in California, I believe the law on the books was that they had to preserve the video for at least 2.5 years or something like that. And so just if you think about them, every car, every hour being videotaped. So, and then the question of, you know, limitless claims. But on the other hand, you know, it only takes one, you know, or a few lawsuits to really almost bankrupt a police, you know, a municipality usually. And a number of these larger police agencies don't have insurance anymore. They're self-insured. So, you know, there's a balancing act there. But I guess my answer is, I think that that's an issue, but there's also kind of, I think, equally compelling reasons from a standpoint of trying to protect liability to do it.
Professor Burbank?
I wanted to ask Professor MacDonald, who I think I heard you say both that you thought that the use of video might conduce to social progress, and I think I heard you say that the use of lawsuits might lead to beneficial changes in police departments. I want to suggest that there is another side to this story, I think, picking up on the last hypo, as it were, and that's exemplified by Scott against Harris, which is the case in which the Supreme Court of the United States decided, because they viewed the video of a chase that had led to the person who was being chased being rendered quadriplegic and had led to a 1983 lawsuit, they viewed the video as being capable of only one interpretation, namely that it wasn't excessive force. They being 8 justices of the Supreme Court of the United States. Justice Stevens said, well, you know, my 8 colleague jurors over here disagree with 11 down below, or however many, who didn't think that this was so clear. Of course, what I'm getting at is that the fact that most lawyers who deal with this medium aren't as sophisticated as you are, and Mr. Kanter in particular, they don't understand, or they understand that other people have cultural predispositions, but they don't really deal with their own. And they and the apparent certainty of this medium can lead to cases being taken away from a jury, and therefore to the loss of the community judgment that it was the goal of the people who gave us the jury to, at least in this country, to have in the first place.
That's a fair point. I hadn't thought about it. 'Cause you're right, there's decision makers, lots of venues that can completely kind of negate what is possibly a positive opportunity. So,
you know, there's some other issues that I think are raised, at least tangentially, by what we're talking about. You know, the Philadelphia Police Department has installed observational cameras all over the city, and they're very proud of this, and you know, talk about it in terms of preventing the kind of demonstrations that we had last year when the Phillies won the World Series. But I don't think the cameras are turned on only after the Phillies win. So you have this sort of specter of Big Brother, where in this case the material is generated, or at least directed by the police department. The other thing is that the shield laws that are generally applied to print journalists, as far as I know, have not been pursued to nearly the same degree for the people who generate video material, documentary filmmakers or whomever. So there are a lot of other legal issues beyond what we're addressing today that are raised by this whole question and the increasing use of video and video surveillance devices.
What do you know about that from what's going on in London? My understanding is that for a lot of years they have had their cameras turned on.
That's true.
And
I've spent about 12 months out of the last 10 years in London, and you can't go anywhere without being on camera. That's how they caught the subway bombers within 2 days.
I'm not really familiar with their system, but the little that I know about the differences between the legal systems in the two countries suggests that there are significant differences in terms of how that material might be utilized.
and I believe I don't know enough about law in the UK, but I believe that the interpretation has been that's public space, and so that it's subjected to surveillance from the government. And from a crime prevention standpoint, aside from catching the bombers, there's a number of studies in the UK that have shown that car theft and robbery go down significantly when you put these cameras out and you advertise them. But there's a whole nother set of issues of what the trade-off is, right? So even if we do get a crime prevention benefit, is it worth the trade-off of, so in San Francisco, they have, I think 30 CCTV cameras up, but they have a third party that monitors them, and they purposely, maybe this has changed recently, but evaluation I read of them, they purposely chose poor quality cameras because they didn't want to give the police too much to look at. And then they also required that the police basically fill out a form to essentially subpoena for the video when they want it. So there in San Francisco, they find some reductions on car theft, but everything else, not much going on. And it's probably because it's kind of just a scarecrow effect. I mean, the police essentially don't really use it because it's such a hassle. So, you know, you have this other trade-off, which is if you have the cameras, but you don't provide the police or another criminal justice agency with direct use of it, then it's probably not going to get used that much, and you know, you're basically just paying for a scarecrow.
So I guess the issues of privacy aren't really sort of front and center of the issues that we're talking about today, but there is a real trade-off between the privacy issues raised by London and England being sort of at one extreme, because while it's public space, and the argument can be made that if you're on the street, then you do not have any right to privacy per se. There's a difference between 20 years ago being on the street and possibly being seen by your neighbor, and being on the street today where there's the ability for the state to aggregate all of this information through not only video, but through your Metro Pass, through the pass that you use to enter your building, so that it's at least feasible for someone to go back and entirely reconstruct your travels for the last month. And the issue has been made by privacy advocates that we are increasingly getting to the point where, you know, in Steven Spielberg's movie Minority Report, you walk down, you know, any street and billboards are speaking to you personally about your personal preferences by reading your iris, with iris scans. So I mean, it does. You have that trade-off between the crime prevention and utter loss of privacy in sort of a Big Brother sense.
The one caveat I would have to that is, how do I say this nicely? The criminal justice agencies aren't very good at using data. So there's probably way more data floating around than is, it's not that it couldn't be used in the Minority Report way, but they're ill-equipped to use the administrative data they currently already have that's about 3 decades old. So, you know, most agencies don't even have analysts who've taken a statistics course before. So, you know, that is changing slowly. It should change, but, you know, we're at the point now where the technology is far outpacing the ability to use it. But you're right, that could change, and then that would raise a whole nother set of issues of privacy. So I think what we have right now is probably a lot, you know, in some spaces, the potential for abuse of privacy, where we just have so much data swimming around and no one really, you know, capitalizing on it.
You mean it's not like CSI?
Far from it. We'd like to change it. I would like to have more skilled analysts in agencies, but I think, you know, from a standpoint of using this data, I mean, it's, and in London, obviously, they're able to catch these people after a terrorist event, but the other thing is many departments don't tape, so it's just a rolling camera. They have somebody watching it, and that's a really boring job to have, and it's hard, you know, that's what the Penn police have. You know, they have some that are being videotaped, but a lot of just people watching it. I think it'd be very hard to stay alert in that kind of setting. It's like working on an assembly line.
Professor Austin?
I had a couple of questions. When you talk about the audience and the audience's acute awareness of what they're watching, I think you would have to mention reality TV and the impact that America's Most Wanted or Cops or any of those programs might have upon the interpretation of surveillance and Vérité police footage. How would an advocate go about taking into account what messages people might have gotten from reality TV? I don't watch the stuff. I mean, I just...
Well, I think, you know, reality TV, first of all, the term, you know, is an oxymoron, because as soon as you call something reality TV, it suggests to me that it's not reality. You know, you have helicopters flying over this isolated island in the Pacific, filming everything that's going on, and they've cast the members or the participants so that, you know, they've already orchestrated the reality. But I think at the same time, you know, when you're presenting visual material, you are presenting it in a context where people's idea of reality is, you know, The Biggest Loser and wrestling smackdown. Everybody knows that wrestling is not real, except they get very excited about it. Did you see what he did to him? And CSI Miami, that has the most beautiful police department I've ever seen, but I've never seen one in reality that ever looked like that, with beautiful neon colors and new modern desks and so on. Not to mention all the female police are beautiful and wear short sleeve uniforms. So I think it's a major problem that when you present something, it doesn't look like primetime television. And that's another piece of recognizing who the audience is, because most of your audience, their reference for video is primetime television. And their expectation is that things work the way it works on television. I know of a case, I was told by a judge of a case where somebody was being tried for incest and rape. And the judge and the whole staff in the courtroom felt that this was an open and shut case where this guy was just absolutely stone guilty. But the defense attorney made a big point out of the fact that there was no DNA evidence, which, you know, convicts or exonerates people every night on television. Other than the fact that there was no DNA evidence, for which there was good reason, it seemed very clear to everyone except the jury that this person was guilty, and this person walked. And you know, this just happened in Philadelphia about 3 or 4 months ago. So I think it's a very good point that you raise, that you need to keep that context in mind as you're presenting material, and address it, you know, in a sense, the way they did in the Rodney King incident, to either desensitize the audience to what they're seeing, or to put what they're seeing in a context. Why is it black and white? Why is it, you know, grainy? Why don't we have, you know, more detail? Why can't we zoom in to show you exactly what the license plate indicates? You know, all those things that they do on television every night, which are not the reality of the visual material that you're likely to have available to you.
Yeah.
I was just wondering two things. Number one, with your new cops, I'm not sure if you might have said this, but did you have a particular agenda you were trying to put forth? Number one. And then number two, after seeing 300 hours of Philadelphia police work, I'm just wondering what your personal opinion is as to their effectiveness.
My agenda was, I guess, more humanistic than political. I am interested in making films about people, and you know, how they think and who they are. And I've made a couple other films about the criminal justice system, and one about juveniles in the system. And I had this opportunity. I was very interested in understanding the police, although I certainly had my biases going in. In answer to your second question, my biases were severely altered by this experience. I think being a cop is a very difficult job. I have great sympathy or empathy for the cops, and at the same time, I feel like most police officers are not qualified for the job that they do, particularly in Philadelphia, which has some of the lowest entry barriers, you know, the lowest requirements for a police officer. John mentioned that the statistics in terms of interaction with the police, arrest, use of force, and so on, suggest that most cops are not arresting people most of the time. Most police officers never use their gun. They're not running around shooting lots of people. They never use their gun. Most of what a police officer does is personal interaction. And that personal interaction takes a mature, sophisticated, intelligent person. There are a lot of excellent police officers but there are a lot of cops who should not be doing that job.
So ineffective or effective?
I would say that most police officers are ineffective. They wait to respond to the radio. They're putting in their time. They're avoiding any kind of dangerous, stressful situations. I mean, police work is inherently stressful, but there are ways to minimize that stress. Most cops don't want to be the first person on the scene. The cops who are more aggressive are the same cops who often step over the line in terms of, search without probable cause, being a little hard on people that they confront, but they're also the ones who are willing to put themselves out there. So it really is a dilemma. When John Timoney was police commissioner, he suggested to me that we either needed a depression or a significant change in the salary structure because they had a hard time recruiting the quality of police officers that they wanted. And that's what their idea of the police officer is, maybe not my idea or possibly your idea.
Just one quick follow-up on that. I think it was the late Professor Alreese said that the pre-qualifications for policing should be the same as they are for the clergy. And what he meant was the type of person that you want to draw into police is not the person that typically goes into police work in terms of their mental orientation.
Last question?
Yeah, for Ron, sort of a question which you can take wherever you want on distribution and access to film, which, I mean, I think your film is really extraordinary. In fact, you might want to tell people how they can actually see the whole film, which I think I saw some time ago, that you may remember. But, it seems like it's so obvious that this film should almost be required viewing in every criminal law, criminal procedure course that every law school teaches, a civil rights law, a con law course, aside from criminology and all these, perhaps some other areas. Can you make some observations about why people, or more people who should be seeing this film are not seeing it, and what are the distribution obstacles you face, and I'll let you answer that. You take it where you want.
I'm not, I don't want to take too much time for something that's maybe a little bit off subject in terms of the legal issues, but part of what qualitative research, which I think documentaries tend to be, what makes them valuable is that they take time to look at something. And the type of film that I make is not a polemic. I hope my bias is relatively moderately evident in the film. People want a quick answer. People want clarity. Documentaries, I think, most often require people to engage, to think, and that's not necessarily what the general public wants. The film works very well in terms of laying out what the job is about. But people often come to the issue of policing and legal issues around policing with a very strong point of view that they want supported one way or the other. So the cops want to be justified, and people who are down on the cops want to crucify them. This film falls somewhere in the middle. Like I said, my opinion is that a job that requires tremendous individual discretion should only be assigned to people who are capable of exercising that discretion. I mean, I think the idea that priest, is an interesting way to pose it. So, I wish I understood better, but I think part of the issue is that people who make films are not necessarily the best people to get films distributed, because that's dealing with product and business issues. And, filmmakers like to think of themselves more as journalists or artists or something in that category. But I would be happy to make the film available to any individual or organization that could utilize it to, help understand what the issues are and understand the police.
Well, thank you, and please join me in thanking Professor McDonald and all